insanity is doing the exact same thing over and over again, expecting shit to change. That is crazy.
Far Cry used to be a series that rarely shied away from trying out new things. So much so that the early three games and their spin offs varied wildly in terms of tonality and direction. The current state of the franchise, however, couldn't be more different. Let's talk about that, shall we? Far Cry 1 released in 2004. It followed Jack Carver on his adventures through uncharted islands as he fought monsters and mercenaries alike. It had its problems, but it's crazy to see how much influence it still holds to the current Far Cry titles. And while it was a success, the most defining moment in the franchise history came with the release of Far Cry 3 in 2012. It was a massive critical and commercial success, so much so that the whole franchise still lives in its shadows to this day as it repeatedly tries to relive its moment of glory once more. But what exactly made Far Cry 3 special? Far Cry 3 featured a plot that felt much more personal than any of the prior titles. Its plot of a man going from innocent to bloodthirsty was nothing new but still was handled competently. Its biggest highlight, however, came in the form of Vas, one of the game's primary antagonists, who, while being detestable, still had a charismatic presence about him. Who, just like the game he is in, would become one of those things that the franchise would try to replicate again and again. Coming back to Far Cry 3, apart from the story and the gorgeous visuals, the game also had other things going for it. It had an in depth crafting system, a wide range of wildlife, and a decent stealth system, which, although not very challenging, was still fairly fresh at the time. 2 years later, we saw the release of Far Cry 4, which was then followed by Far Cry 5 and most recently by Far Cry 6. And the similarities in terms of both gameplay and story couldn't have been more apparent. The games became less Far Cry and more freedom fighters, with the premise of each plot boiling down to the same thing, where one no-name chump joins rebel forces who are resisting against a mysterious and charismatic leader, and then proceeding to single-handedly overthrow them along with their lieutenants. Although none of the Far Cry games have had well-written protagonists, at least Jason Brody's killing fantasy was tied into the plot, unlike the later games who play the liberation card again and again. Alright, so keeping the premise and plot aside, how has the gameplay evolved? Well, there ain't much evolution to talk about here. The gameplay still remains similar to Far Cry 3, except it's more ridiculous and comical than ever before. The animal buddy system introduced in supernatural Shangri-La missions in Far Cry 4 is still here, with each installment making it even more ridiculous. And yes, they're still using the drug hallucination trope from Far Cry 3. Yes, we get it. The games are not realistic. Is that necessarily a bad thing? No, it's not. But if you're no longer bound by realism, least you can do is take full creative advantage of it, rather than playing safe each time. There is one game in the franchise, however, that holds such a distinction to its peers that it might be the key to the franchise creative redemption. Far Cry 2's direction, its mechanics, and the things that it gives priorities to are so wildly different from Far Cry 6 that they seem completely unrelated if played alongside each other. It takes inspiration from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a serious book that has inspired other media like Apocalypse Now and the narrative masterpiece that is Spec Ops The Line. Quite the contrast when comparing it to a game where you fight alongside chickens and alligators. It puts realism at its forefront. The game is almost completely grounded. You are a small fry and remain a small fry in this world. There are no good and bad sides, and everyone is the enemy of everyone else. The game is punishing. It really makes you feel like you're stuck in a lethal and hostile world. Combat is unrelenting, even on lower difficulties. Enemies chase you for miles, guns can jam and even break permanently. Things like your map are actual objects rather than being a piece of UI, as more recently seen in the Metro series. In fact, the game has very little UI and places a much larger emphasis on immersion. While replaying it, its limited fast travel and the malaria mechanic also reminded me of Red Dead Redemption 2 in a way. Far Cry 2 represents a game philosophy that I doubt Ubisoft will have the balls to pull off again. It is a difficult and punishing game, but if there has ever been a market for those kind of games, it's now. Another thing that I noticed was how different its approach to side content is. While the current Ubisoft is famous for its checklisting side content, Whatever it has is mostly good and doesn't overstay its welcome. Well, is it perfect? No. It's quite janky, there are barely any memorable characters, and a good stealth system would have been nice. But, in my opinion, it is a brilliant candidate for Far Cry 7 to take inspiration from. Alright, so apart from Far Cry 2, what are the other games that the next Far Cry could take inspiration from? When it comes to difficulty, the Metro series is the best example of difficulty done right in a shooter. Instead of making you weak and the enemies bullet sponges, it makes everyone die in a couple shots, as they realistically should. When it comes to side content, focus on quality instead of quantity. Mass Effect 2 is a great example. Most of the major side content is good and weaves directly into the main story. Even smaller side quests are designed in a way that they can be easily finished while doing the main missions, which helps the game maintain a tight pacing. More good examples include Mafia 2 and LA Noire, both of which are open world but have very little side content. Instead, they use their open worlds as backdrops for their rich stories. This gives the writers full control over the narrative's pacing, resulting in such a well edited and cinematic experience that is rarely delivered by open world games. And while Far Cry doesn't have to go in that extremely, it still shows that open world games don't need to have unnecessary side content in order to be enjoyable. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. If this video does well, I would love to make more videos like these. Anyway, thanks for watching.